previous panels, so you'll have heard all my housekeeping multiple times. But I try and make it interesting and fun every time. Housekeeping stuff. Oh, there we are, the mics are on as well. Yeah, so I'll start again. I know some of you have been to some of the other talks. I'm sorry if you've got to sit through all my setup and housekeeping and who I am again, but I try and say it differently every time. But every time it's probably still a bit boring hearing about me. But never mind. I'm Gareth Mitchell. I'm your friendly host for this session. And I am one of the science communication lecturers at Imperial College, just next door. And so I'm in my element today because I've been communicating science, or at least being the mediator for science communication happening all day. So I'm kind of, you know, I spend my day job teaching it. I'm actually doing it now. This is actually rather scary. But also I work at the BBC as one of the science presenters on the radio. So a lot of the time I'm doing this in a studio. So it's nice to actually have a real audience here. And it's just lovely to actually here to be with real people on a panel. You know, like 6 months ago, this would have been on Zoom, wouldn't it? So it's really lovely to have our panel and all of you. So hurrah for the vaccine. That's what I say. So the vaccine got a round of applause in one of the other sessions. So we're going to talk about the future of mobility and green transport, and really we've got an hour to chew through this tricky topic, really. We all, rightly, we want to get around. We need to get around for our work and our jobs, and maybe even to do nice things like come to the Great Exhibition Road Festival. And yet, at the same time, we're very aware that transport is a huge contributor to carbon emissions, and there's a real tension there. So how do we still maintain mobility and all the economic necessities that come from it, whilst at the same time being kind or kinder to the planet? So that we've got an hour to talk about that today. Just a little bit on the COVID housekeeping. As you can see, I have taken my face covering off, as have our panel, but we are asking you, lovely audience, to keep your face coverings on. And if you think, who am I to stand here on the podium and preach to you when I haven't got mine on? As you'll see, we are distanced by 1 metre each, and we're not facing each other, and we're a safe distance away from all of you. So that's why we're not wearing face coverings, but you're all a bit closer to each other, and so we're following all the COVID guidelines, and that means face masks on, if that would be okay. So thank you, folks, for understanding that. Also, a huge hello, not just to you in the audience, but also to our people watching online. This is streaming online, so a big hello to you on the internet. Hello, internet. And look, I've got an iPad here in front of me, which is going to have your questions on. So you've got a direct route to me. These people have to put their hand up and come all the way to the microphone to pose their questions. If you're just sitting at home, just type something into the chat box and I'll see it, as long as it's not rude or horrible, because that'll get blocked by the moderators. But in decent questions, I'll see them. So please do. I want questions from people at home. This is going to be interactive. There will be a lot of me asking questions, but when I run out of questions, basically I turn over to you and you just carry me through the second half of the discussion. So that's probably all you need to know about today, apart from that this is one of the One World series of events, and we're here at the Great Exhibition Road Festival, and it's not just today or tomorrow, it's not just a weekend thing, but these events and talks and demonstrations and other fun stuff, including leaf painting going on as we speak, Imperial College next door, which I think is absolutely fabulous. Isn't that great, panel? Those of us at Imperial College seeing leaf painting going on in our place of work. That's great. So that gives you a sense of all the things that are going on. Participate and get involved. So there you are. That's all my setup. But enough of all that. Let's say hello to our panel. And we have brought together deliberately a panel with some different perspectives, different viewpoints, and from different parts of the world as well. So I'm going to say hello to Jiayu first. This is Dr Jiayu Wu, who's Reader in Intelligent Mobility Design at the Royal College of Art, which is one of the institutions participating in the festival. And you focus on the digital integrated human experience. Which, so this is, would you call this digitally integrated in that we've got an online audience, or maybe not?
Yes, but from the mobility field, maybe it's something else slightly different.
Okay, oh, we'd have a seminar about that, couldn't we? Lovely, all right. So, but it gives you an idea of Jianyu's research interests, and also you've done a lot of work in China, and you have some very interesting perspectives, as we'll hear, about how attitudes to mobility differ, especially I think in terms of young people between China and the UK, for instance. So we'll get into all of that. You used to work at Volkswagen, overseeing service design as well. So you have a background in automotive design, and then that's brought you to your research post at the Royal College of Art.
Yes.
And you're very welcome to the panel. Now, we also have Dr. Mark Richards over here, over there, Senior Teaching Fellow in Imperial's Department of Physics, and also the co-founder of Duvas Technologies. So that's a spin-out company from Imperial, and they specialise in wireless air sensing networks, and that enables real-time air quality and air pollution mapping. So you're going to get on very well with this guy at the front, by the way, because he specialises in that as well. So that gives you a sense of what Mark's into. So he's really strong on sort of air quality and air pollution, but also this crucial real-time monitoring of air quality and how that can help us with in real time, the planning of our transport and monitoring of that as well. So that's Mark. Also, just sitting next to me is Dr. Ian Mudway, Senior Lecturer in Imperial School of Public Health. So you have 25 years of researching the impacts of air pollution, and you don't look old enough to have been doing this for 25 years, but Ian says apparently he does. And also looking at the links between where people live and their exposure, which is absolutely crucial, you know, because we're very aware, isn't it, Ian? And perhaps we could start the conversation with you, that you are at greater risk, even, you know, so say you're living on a busy main road, and there's a street just running parallel to the main road. There's a huge difference in the exposure between those two settings, isn't there?
For certain things.
Okay, right. So the caveat,
there's
right.
a lecture in that as well.
Oh, marvellous. Well, we've got enough to talk about for an hour then. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the range of expertise of our panel. And I think what would be really interesting to start with you, Jiayu, I mentioned that there are differing attitudes between China and the UK, and I think especially amongst young people. So if you ask a Chinese young person about their desire, their aspiration to get a car, for instance, what are they likely to tell you?
Wow, it's very different. It will be different because people are different and every individual will be different. So I think there are people who are willing to buy a new car, and especially now in the Chinese market, there are a lot of electric vehicles coming out, especially the startup companies, and loads of them. And on the other hand, in a lot of major cities and with the development of the public transport, and a lot of people wouldn't need a car. So I think it really depends on how people think about that.
Yeah, sure. Because I've read quite a lot that amongst young people in the UK, this aspiration, this rite of passage, as it might have been in my day, to get a car, that's waning. And conveniently, I can see a row of young people over there. So I wonder if you can just let me know, folks, obviously I don't know how old you are, but put your hands up if you really want to, if you're not 17 already, put your hands up if you're really, as soon as you turn 17, you just want to get a car. Do any of you want to? So it's about 1.5, oh, 3. Okay, so for people at home who might not be able to see them and the rest of the audience, there's not many hands going up amongst the 5 young people on that row, so they're not exactly giving the sense that they're going to rush out and do their driving test as soon as they turn 17, but they haven't ruled it out. So just interesting to gauge. I'm interested in attitudes, because Mark, I think that brings me to you to ask you how you've seen in your long research career attitudes changing to transport especially.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for dating me with my long research career.
Well, I said it about Ian, so I just had to even it.
No, absolutely. No, I think, to be fair, in the early 2000s, when I was doing research on air pollution, particularly air pollution monitoring, because part of the issue was we had a sense that there was issues with air quality, but we didn't necessarily have the measurement techniques to really understand it at let's say, a granular level, street-by-street basis. We had to rely on much more global models. But I think that over time, once sensors have become more accurate and they can be more pervasive, if you like, we're able to get a better insight into the effect of transport and air quality. And I think part of that has helped to shift the sort of general mindset. I mean, it's one thing saying that cars pollute, it's another thing seeing pollution maps of where these areas, where these dense areas of pollution are, or for example, actually being able to identify polluting vehicles and seeing how much of a difference it makes, even to, in built-up areas. So I think part of that has sort of permeated into the attitude of, let's say, the next generation. So I hope that, I presume part of that might make them think more about not just a car to get around from A to B and have fun, but also what sort of footprint, if you like, what impact it may have on the environment as well. So I think it has definitely changed, and public awareness has become much more increased than when I first started on it many moons ago.
Yeah, no, sure. In your long and distinguished research career there, Mark, and all of you, so I'm not being ageist just against Mark there. You've got to cover yourself in this job, haven't you? Right, now then. So a question for you, Ian, because I'm mea culpa here. I have a motorbike. And in fact, some people say, oh, if you've got a bike, that's not so bad, because the fuel consumption on a motorbike actually is much better than the car. But actually, it isn't really. It's not much better than a car. So that's one thing. So I'm just unburdening my guilt on you, audience, here. But I am leading up to a question to Ian. On a recent motorbike trip, I've got, like a visor, like a windshield thing on the motorbike. And it was getting covered with flies. So I was wiping them off. And then I thought, I'll just wipe the inside of this. I've never tried wiping it on the inside. You'd think, what could possibly be on the inside? There were no insects. But when I took away the cloth, it was black from whatever particles or something horrible had landed on the inside of the screen. And I thought, that surely is also going into my body. So you are sitting here as an expert in air pollution. I suppose what I'm after is a sort of overview, in a way, of just what the risks are.
So if I'm going to talk about your driving experience, that doesn't surprise me in the slightest.
It's awful.
And
yeah.
the pollution you can see, there's still the pollution you can't see, which wasn't trapped on the inside of your visor. And that's not just from your motorcycle. If you're driving on a road, you're in the highest possible concentration of air pollution. Effectively, you're driving through an invisible tunnel of all the exhaust emissions of every vehicle in front of you. And I think that's a really important message, because there's sometimes this polarization between drivers and pedestrians. But drivers, unless you can afford a top-of-the-range car with perfect air filters, you have the highest exposures of anybody. You're at the greatest risk of the pollution coming from your own vehicles, and that gets lost. Now, in terms of, is that bad for your health? I mean, I can park this question, because I could have answered that question 25 years ago and said, it's completely bad for your health in a myriad of ways. The evidence base is incredibly strong. It's been strong for such a long time that I sometimes wonder why sometimes we do more studies to address the same thing. If anything, what's happened is that we've learned that air pollution has more effects across more diseases and across more points in your life than we previously thought. So if I was sitting here 10 years ago, I'd have told you about asthma. I'd have told you about cardiovascular disease, how it makes symptoms worse in individuals who have chronic respiratory conditions. But now I'd be telling you about early life effects in children, poor organ development, impacts on the brain, mental health, dementia. And all of these things would seem as though I was spiraling into the worlds of fantasy. But the evidence base is incredibly strong, not just through statistical epidemiology, but from our understanding of the way in which the chemicals in the air we breathe impact on the human body. So you were breathing not just little black particles, you were breathing a cocktail of complex, uncombusted petroleum gas sort of volatiles. I mean, it's something you should reflect on.
I'm sitting here reflecting on it quite actively at this moment, Ian, yes.
Can I maybe
Mark,
just add to that, just from a measurement perspective, because we did, many years ago, we did do a sort of an experiment, if you like, where we had two identical units and we were walking around with them and they measure local air pollution. And it wasn't actually that far from here. And what we were just trying to test to see if they were both sort of, comparable. But then we decided to have one person walk into like the central reservation of the main road and the other person stand basically at the pavement. And there was a huge difference in pollution levels in the center of in the central reservation of a busy road compared to the side of a road. So it sort of backs up your point that you're saying about being in the center of the road, whether you're in a car or a bike, unless you've got really good air filters, you're going to be exposed to huge spikes in pollution. And then the other thing I'd say, in terms of, because these sensors could measure a suite of different types of pollutants, we were able to see, for example, volatile organic carbons, sort of benzene-based chemicals, and they are known as a carcinogen. So you could probably add aspects of cancer to that list that you've added as well, which potentially pollution can impact on.
Yeah, and of course this is pedestrians, cyclists.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we will talk further about the problems and how we monitor those problems. But Jiayu, I'm kind of looking at you for some hope here, because your expertise is in intelligent mobility design. So is that another way of saying you're trying to find intelligent solutions to some of the problems that we've been hearing?
Yeah. I think that's our, aims to look for different solutions for different people. For example, we all know that we're doing electric vehicles is doing well, and the shared mobility is another big topic, and a lot of companies and governments are trying to do that, but it's a very difficult thing because a lot of people don't want to share the vehicles. And of course, the future autonomous vehicles, and a lot of governments would like to think that the future autonomous vehicles should be shared, so that people are easily to use them, and when they want one, they just come to your door and pick you up. So a lot of solutions, and I think.
Yeah, and with electric vehicles, it does seem, certainly if London's anything to go by, that we're still wedded to this idea of individualised transport. I know people who are buying electric vehicles mainly because they look down their nose at me for having a polluting motorbike, and I don't blame them either. But nonetheless, they may have the moral high ground, but they're still part of this, it's my car, I put it on my charging point. They don't think of sharing it with other people, and they seem to be quite resistant to going into those sharing schemes. There's still quite a challenge there, isn't there?
I think that's part of our research, to find out people's behavioral patterns, and how do they want to use the car, and where do they want to charge it, so that we know where to put the charging points or charging stations. So there are a lot of solutions there. For example, if you go out to the street now and you can see the lamppost charging, and you probably you didn't see them, and they're hidden away. And now they have this pop-up charging and a lot of solutions. And it's really how do you provide better solutions that people actually want to use them and willing to use them, or you attract them to use them.
Yeah, no, exactly. Because how do you persuade people? Because it's such a fundamental change, isn't it, to move from that individualised transport that people have just grown up with, really, to then say, well, no, don't do that. Just get one of these cars that you can just go and pick it up from a certain charging point, flash, and you've got an app, and it'll unlock the car for you. You can drive it around for an hour and then take it back to the charging point. And I still get the impression of some resistance to that.
Yeah, I think there's fundamental problems for people to uptake them. So one of them is the cost. If we bring down the cost, of course, a lot of people would like to have them. And the other thing is convenience. So I'm actually considering buying an electric vehicle, but then I'm just thinking, okay, where I'm going to charge it, especially, people living in the city and they don't have a garage. And there are, news, and I saw that people trying to charge their vehicle on the street and, putting a wire on the pavement, and they basically provide a kind of harassment for the other people. So it's really sometimes how do we develop this infrastructure, for people to better use them.
Okay, and also so returning to the dangers of air quality, and of course, Ian, we've had the death of schoolgirl, and then the landmark court case that emerged from it, Ella Adu Kissi Deborah, in South London, and that must have had an effect on people's awareness and the legal status as well of air pollution.
Well, I mean, for somebody like me, it's a bit of a tragedy that we have to reflect on such a tragic case for people to see the legal ramifications of something which already has legal standards embedded in law. We have a legal obligation to meet EU limit values, and for some of them, such as NO2, we have persistently failed for many years to live up to those standards. They were set to protect the public health. If you don't meet them, by definition, you are failing the public health. And yet somehow you have to see the individualized casualty of that for people to take this seriously. So I think that her mother was incredibly brave to push that case forward and to get to a position in which you could say that air pollution contributed substantially towards a premature death. That is an important finding, because suddenly there will be other cases, and people will begin to see air pollution appearing as a causative agent on death certificates, and that will change the nature of the debate. But we kind of know this is happening. We know that air pollution is causing exacerbations in asthma. We know it's causing hospitalizations. We know that it makes symptoms worse because we can see the relationship between the exposures and medication usage, yes? All of this is known. Yeah. And yet people have sort of like kind of almost put their hands over their ears at the point at which it may impact on the way in which they live and sort of like live their lives and go about their daily lifestyles.
Yeah. And so, Mark, it's not for the lack of data, is it? And especially, thanks to technologies and startups like yours. I suppose what was so shocking about this case was that this was like internal pollution. This girl was killed in her home, So it says a lot about the air quality inside people's homes when they live near busy roads.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unless you live in a totally sealed unit, outdoor air quality is going to impact indoor air quality, as well as activities in the home can also add to it as well. But even that aside, so we have to think of air quality as not just something out there, but it's something that's, shall we say, ubiquitous. I mean, in terms of I think, moving legislation on, coming from an instrumentation type of background, I would say that legislation is largely based on what they call best available technology at that time. And so even though, in terms of research, you can move on to sort of produce great technology, and even local authorities within their environmental groups or sections will really like the technology and buy into the vision and want to adopt the technology. But ultimately, if they are not mandated to do so, it's very hard to justify the resources being put into that area. So in a sense, there is this sort of virtuous circle where the legislators are mandating what measurements we should perform on behalf of the public, but they're informed by the best available technology. And because there's this lag, the legislation is always behind the technology. So there is something that perhaps needs to be addressed so that we can become much more proactive rather than sort of reactionary to a lot of what's going on.
Yeah, and I've got some questions coming in from the online audience, and we'll get some of yours in a moment. But just Mark, just whilst you're talking, can you tell us about the cutting edge now in sensors and air quality monitoring, and how capable I'd be able to, can I have a plug-in for my mobile phone that will just measure the air quality in this room? Take us to where it's at.
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, if we start from where we were, which were effectively large air quality monitoring stations that look like a large shed or something like that, with lots of components in that sample the air in and measure different types of things in the air sort of individually. That's effectively what sort of, if you like, powers the urban air quality network even now. However, aside from that, sensors generally, without sort of going into specifics, they've become smaller. They've now become portable or mobile. And then, of course, with all the data infrastructure, the sort of IT infrastructure behind it, cloud computing, etc., you're now in a position to gather data, if you like, the metadata, to get a much better sort of visibility of what's happening. Whereas before, you'd feed those sparse air quality monitoring stations into some global model, which will give you a good sort of global average, over 24 hours or over, half of London type of thing. But in reality, as individuals, we breathe in and out every few seconds, and we want to know what the air quality is like immediately around us. So that requires much better resolution. So the sensors are there, the infrastructure is there, But ultimately, it takes something like, I'd say, I don't know, the Mayor of London or something like that to actually bring all these elements together so that we could have an integrated approach to really understanding air quality.
Yeah, and is that, you're hinting it's probably not happening like that at the moment then? There's a way to go, is there?
Well, yeah, because it takes resources, it takes partly legislation and policymakers, and also, I mean, but I would say that it's not necessarily the technology that's holding things back at this stage. That's what I would say in terms of where we are.
Yeah, so there are other factors, and yeah, you know, and I think many of us can guess what they are. So, Jiayu, I mean, what about in China? Because you know, famously there is that Beijing smog. And China, given the way that China works, they said, well, we're not having that anymore, and they just sort of changed the legislation there and then, and of course everybody complied because it's China, and they solved it, didn't they? Or is that success story, is that exaggerated? That was my understanding of it.
And to be honest, I can't comment on it because it's not my research. It's a policy kind of level. So
yeah, no, fully understand. But what I can do is actually really bring you back to your research then, because I am into, you know, Mark was saying that we need this more integrative approach, and it needs to be led from the top. So that is a policy issue, which I won't take you into. But just help us out, though, you know, with the intelligent mobility design around this. You know what? I guess you have things feeding into it, like lots of air quality monitoring. Then you have the technologies themselves, and then you have desired outputs that can be engineered. Can I adopt a systems approach kind of question in posing that to you? Or?
Yeah. So from the kind of individual perspective, you know, how could we design the vehicles that has less emissions, but also, you know, people would be willing to use them, of course. So I don't know if we can show the picture, actually.
I'm sure, yeah, we have a slide deck there, so if you just say the picture you want, they should.
Yeah, we have this Nano share picture, if we can use that.
Yeah, sure, it might take them a while to find it. Yeah,
that's one of the designs we did for a project called MOF, and it's looking at the shared mobility. And because a lot of people are actually rejecting this shared kind of idea or concept. So we were looking at solutions that how we could bring people to, you know, be liking about the shared idea. So this is one of the, you know, we call it Nano. So it's very small taxi service kind of design. So it's like it can rotate 360 degrees, and every single passenger has its own their own entry to go into the vehicle, so that they won't, you know, disturb other people. So they have their own entrance. And then, you know, the seating, we also look at the, you know, kind of flexible seating. They can, you know, fold it or unfold it, so that people, if they don't want to talk with other people or don't want to have, you know, social interaction, then they can just unfold it and have a kind of a wall, and they can, you know, like a cocoon for themselves. So I think it's just, you know, a lot of solutions or designs we can explore to, you know, help people, to attract people to adopt this kind of new services.
Yeah, I think they had a similar vehicle at an exhibition in the V&A, and I remember sitting in it, and you could bring the screen up or down if you were feeling antisocial. That looks like a glimpse to the future. Are these happening now? Are there certain cities rolling these out? Oh, excuse the pun, that was unintended, but are they being rolled out in other cities, or is this still something of a concept?
This is a concept.
Okay, right.
We're hoping that some people can, you know, roll it out.
Yeah, that's cool. So, audience members, would you, when they roll them out, would you roll into one of those, do you think? Yeah? Lots of nodding. In fact, let's put your hands up and I can see what you're saying then. That's better, yeah. Yeah, okay, so it's a good 2/3 of the audience there saying, yeah, we'd be up for that. That's good. What a lovely audience. They're very sociable, sharing audience. So, okay, whilst I'm flattering you, let's get some questions from you. Who wants to come up to the microphone? So we've got one from the front. I'm just looking for people who haven't posed questions so far. So, I don't know what to do now. We've got two at the front. Okay, you can both go. So let's go for you first, and then you. So the mic should be working. If you just go up, yes, I should have said, to the mic stand. And feel free to say your name, but you don't have to.
Thank you, panellists. My name is Francesca. I am a town councillor, And one of the things that that is a huge problem, and it's one of the reasons that I went into my career choice, which is solar energy, is to try and improve air quality and have green technologies built in and become a part of infrastructure. One of the things that is becoming a real issue in my town is, and it's similar to what's happening in cities, is overdevelopment. And by cramming lots and lots of new builds that are just adding to the issue of fossil fuel use, there's no regulation, there's no building laws that say that developers have to put in renewable technologies, they have to do any of this. And then people are being forced into living in smaller and smaller places. The congestion is absolutely terrible, and yet people's lives are being affected. And I feel very strongly that this is almost teetering on the edge of affecting people's human rights to breathe clean air. How, as a town councillor and someone who has lived and studied in London and had experienced the negative detriments of city urban air quality, how can a town councillor, how can an individual do something about the poor quality conventional development that is continuing to be proliferated, and the effects that has on congestion and just overdevelopment? Thank you.
Thanks, Francesca.
Can I answer your question? I mean, I can't answer your question because what I'm going to tell you is the battle you've got ahead, because it's something which drives me utterly insane. Clearly, when we talk about green mobility in our urban cities going forward, it's not just about the cars we drive, okay? It's not just about replacing every car we have at the moment with a new technology which is less pollution. It's fewer cars, it's more pedestrianisation, it's more cycling and active transport. But planning is absolutely central, because we can't be doing one thing to reduce emissions and improve air quality on one hand, and then having the planning departments doing something which is completely opposed to it. So if we, for example, in London do something and we reduce, let's take PM 2.5, say it fell by 2.5%, we'd be so happy. But if we then built cheap, affordable housing, targeted at young families, built next to busy roads because it's the cheapest available land, which gives the greatest profit to the developers, yes? We're actually increasing the actual exposures in the most vulnerable individuals, whilst patting ourselves on the back about our policies to improve public health. And there should be absolutely no way that those two things should have been allowed to pull apart, yes? Because you effectively are, and I can understand your point, putting the most vulnerable in harm's way, whilst acting virtuously as far as it seems to other people. The only way, and I've argued this before, is I believe that directors of public health should at some point have a veto on development schemes, so that when they are planning development, it's not just about economic growth, it's about considering potential impacts on public health in that area. And I think getting them involved as early as possible is the only way to actually shift this debate.
Yeah, because otherwise you just end up with the councils meeting a whole load of targets in terms of accommodating people, and then just exposing a whole load of other people, and like you say, the poorer people, to huge amounts of air pollution. Whilst you're talking there, Ian, I think this one it will be for you. It's from Hysop, who says, despite the supply of electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, I guess there are still detrimental impacts of non-exhaust emissions. It's things like brake wear, tyre wear, roadside abrasion. You're going to get that in EVs as well, aren't you?
Yeah, no, I was holding myself back.
Oh, right. So you can hold forth now. Here we go.
There's a phrase which we see increasingly on adverts where they talk about zero-emission vehicles. There's no such thing. There's never been a thing called a zero-emission vehicles. Vehicles make emissions. They make them from different places. And we may have a zero tailpipe emission vehicle, and there are great assets to that. But actually, most vehicles contribute more in terms of brake wear and tyre wear to our measured PM 2.5 concentrations than they do via the exhaust. Electric cars are heavier. They potentially could actually add to brake dust and tyre wear. And I think it's a mistake to assume that those components are safe. So we have to be holistic, and we've got to consider all sources.
Right. Yeah, no, I get it. Because I think there's some I think it might be an Imperial student project that involves like a prototype to soak up, as it were, the emissions from tyres, the tyre wear. You know,
there's the
they're
tyre
capturing using electrostatics, isn't it, or something?
Yeah,
so it collects the tyre particles and stops them going into the atmosphere.
But remember, there is no current regulation. You know, you have to have regulations for emissions from the combustion engine. There's nothing for tyre wear. There's nothing for brickware. It's a big sort of black hole in our regulation about vehicle emissions.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Ian. So let's go for your question. Yes, it's not Alex, is it? You'll tell me what your name is now. So is it Alex?
No, Alex is my friend here.
That's what I thought, yeah, he's Alex.
My name's Pete.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got a question for you, Ian. We know that not all air pollutants are equal, so some pollutants are more toxic than others. Do you know how much more toxic carbonaceous or fossil fuel aerosols might be versus, say, silicates from the desert storms or secondary organics from agriculture? And a question for you, Mark, about measuring ultrafine particles. So we know that ultrafine particles are anything under PM.1, but we only have 4 monitoring stations in the UK, I believe. Is there any plan to measure more, especially around airports, because we know that they're much more toxic than, let's say, PM2.5? And I guess for all of you, you've been campaigning for years about making change, but you must be very frustrated in how little change has been made. Mark, you mentioned that we need to be more proactive than reactive, but what needs to happen for that to change?
Okay, well, shall we go with Mark on that first, and you can take that first point then, Ian. So over to you, Mark.
Ultrafine particles, nanoparticles, and so on. There's no doubt that they do pose a danger because they can lodge in the lungs, and I'm sure Ian can tell you more about the health effects, but also they're quite difficult to detect as well. So I think in the research community there is always plans to try and find ways of how we can identify these particles. So I'm certainly relatively comfortable that there is some level of research going on, but ultimately it does, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it leads to the same issue that once you've developed this sensing capability, you have to convince the powers that be, the policy makers. I don't want to say politicians, but effectively the policy makers to actually develop or provide the legislation that reflects that. And that's where I think the bottleneck is. I think the public can play, and have done in the past, they can play a key role in many ways, because the one thing that politicians are more likely to listen to is public concern if it's directed in the right way. So part of trying to move things forward is almost like a marketing campaign and a relationship with the general public to make them aware of what is possible, but then the onus is, to some extent, is partly on the public to try and then convince the policymakers. So that's the process I see, but I do agree that it is frustrating because even though we develop the technology to see it, all it's really doing is telling you something which we already know to some extent, but it's giving you that visible way of appreciating it. And so that's part of the frustration. And normally, in a way, you may say, well, what's the point in developing it if it won't get implemented? But in reality, if you don't actually have that visibility, then, I don't know, sometimes it's easier to for some to accept a pretty lie than the ugly truth. And by developing these technology, you are actually at least unveiling what the real situation is. So then it's harder to avoid that or cover it over with some sort of, as I said, pretty lie or whatever you want to call it.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So we're getting a ton of questions coming in about autonomous, driverless vehicles. So I want to get to those as well. But Ian, if you can take the first of those points, and briefly if you can.
I think at the present moment in time, if you were to look at the scientific community, because they regulate by PM mass, yes? They regulate with the assumption that everything within PM mass is equally as toxic. Unsurprisingly, as a toxicologist, I think that's completely wrong. And I think there's sufficient evidence to suggest that certain bits of it are more toxic than other, and the organic fractions related to the emissions from internal combustion engines, specifically diesel, I would put near the top. But I don't think you then neglect the other components beneath that, which all potentially have some potential action, yes? We need more information. They revised the WHO figures last week, and I was listening to all the online discussions, and what the public kept on saying wasn't, why is it now 5 and not 10? They started talking about chemicals. Which of the chemicals are harmful? And so actually the sort of regulation is behind what the public want and almost behind what the public's understanding of the problem is. So that ranking becomes incredibly important going forward.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Ian. And I wonder, Jiayu, with you, if we can take it into autonomous and sort of driverless vehicles. I've got a question of my own, and I'll roll it in with these two from the audience at home. So Dan Rawkins asks, with firms like Tesla making great advancement in full self-driving, how long do you think it'll be until the UK government legalises this? M.R. Khan says self-drive is available in electrical vehicles. People love new tech. So in other words, existing EVs have some kind of automation in them. People love new technology, so if we legalise self-drive cars, then people will be more inclined to buy EVs, which will help to clear up air quality, apart from all the brake pollution and all that stuff that Ian was saying. Maybe when and if the government legalise autonomous driving, then the government should only allow it on EVs, should only allow that autonomous driving on electric vehicles in order to encourage people to buy them. Now, that's more of a policy question from M.R. Khan, but your expertise, Jiayu, includes design. And so I wonder, from a design point of view, kind of what's been holding them back so far and what might lead to that advancement, if it happens at all?
So I think for electric vehicles, the things holding people back is really the charging point issues. So imagine that, yes, a lot of people living in the city, of course, they don't have a place to charge their cars, and they have to maybe walk 20 minutes away from their flats or house to charge the vehicle, or using the office time to charge the vehicle, things like that. And if they go on the long distance trip, then unless the car can, drive a long way, then they have to find a charging station to, deal with this. So it's really, I think, now how do we boost the taking of, using the electric vehicles is really where are we going to, put these charging stations, and, how people would like to use the chargers, that kind of things. And for the autonomous vehicles, it's a really good question, and I think in the field, and from the technology people to us, the researchers, we all ask the same question: when can we get the fully autonomous vehicles? And I think the answer is, from my understanding, is still quite a long way to go. So. And I think there are a lot of, legal issues, and also, the people's acceptance issues. For example, safety. A lot of people would think that, okay, I like to use autonomous vehicles to take my children from home to school, but is that safe? If I'm not there, then are my children safe? And also, if it's safe, okay, so. And usually the parents would, watch the children to go, from the car to the school and to go inside the school. What about that period of time? Is it safe for them? So there are, all sorts of humanity questions that people are asking.
Yeah,
so.
Which to me seems a little bit ironic, because human beings only have optical sensors called eyes and auditory sensors called ears. And the eyes only look in one direction, whereas autonomous vehicles have 360-degree vision in not just in infrared, I think it is, in LiDAR, they're bristling with sensors. So a parent actually, presumably, if they're thinking rationally, would say their child is safer in an autonomous vehicle than they are with the mother or the father driving.
If the system is working, of course, it's safer, but depends on.
I think we may, just in case we're missing it, because we're individualizing this mobility issue.
Sure.
Let's not lose sight of the fact that tens of millions of people right now use buses to go to work, use the tube to go to work, the train network to go to work, cycle, and actually walk to work. So if we're talking about people who make an elective decision, and sometimes it's a choice because they could take other modes and they have a vehicle, we have to bear this in mind. It may not be autonomous because there's somebody driving it, but it is a way of publicly conveying people at density in a vehicle between A and B, yes? Those infrastructure, transport infrastructures, mass infrastructures, are as much a part about future green mobility as an individualized vehicle for an individual.
Yeah. So I think Ian really is really keen, and rightly, to move the discussion away from this obsession that I was critiquing right at the beginning, actually, about individualised transport. Let's move away from that, says Ian. And many of us, probably all of us here in this room, have been doing that today in terms of how we got here using public transport. So I know we have 2 questions from the audience. So let's take them in the terms of hands up. So you can go first, and then I'll come to you, and then over there as well. So we've got about 15 minutes to go, so it's going to be a busy 15 minutes. Fasten your seatbelts. Oh, another pun, there it goes, right.
So I live in Western Canada, and I've seen my city burn, and wildfires have now become the norm, not the exception. And it's got to the point now where we literally are trying to seal our buildings because the air quality indoors is better than that outdoors. So how do we change it so that we can control the air quality within our buildings to a greater extent and protect those inside, or even in vehicles, in buses? How do we change that dialogue?
Which sounds like one tip for you, Mark, then, really, just controlling the air quality indoors.
Yeah, well, I think, believe it or not, it starts, first of all, by monitoring the air quality indoors. And I think there are a suite of indoor air quality monitors in various ways, and you can even have CO2 monitors, all sorts of different types of monitors, which you can virtually get off the shelf. It doesn't do any harm if you have a concern about indoor air quality to at least monitor your own local environment. That would at least tell you what types of pollutants you're exposed to, if you are indeed, and what levels, what thresholds you can tolerate or not. And then you'll be more informed about what sort of action you want to take. I mean, it's not quite answering it specifically, but I always start from let's be guided by the data and not just sort of, emotion/opinion. Let's see what the data actually says to see what level of risk we're really being exposed to.
Right, and Ian was nodding his head. Just whilst you're talking there, let's get you over to the mic, sir, and then Ian's point, and then person at mic. So I'm saving time here.
What I was going to say is if you're in an area of forest fires, your biggest concern is outdoor air quality, yes? Absolutely, completely understand that. But there are potential risks if you don't have extreme events of sealing a house. Because indoor air quality consists of chemicals which are venting out of the furnishings of your house, VOCs, and semi-volatile compounds, some of which can actually exacerbate asthma. So you end up with a situation where we have this dilemma where do you ventilate, do you not ventilate? How much do you worry about infiltration of outdoor pollution indoor? How much do you worry about trapping indoor pollutants indoors in the environment? Forest fires are a special example because they are so bad, yes, but sealing a house completely doesn't necessarily completely make it safe in terms of air pollution.
Right, yeah, so don't necessarily tape up the windows, which I suppose has taken us a little way from transport, but then of course we know that transport is a big worry about the stuff that's coming in through the windows. So, let's name and question, if you will.
Good afternoon. My question's for anyone that can answer it. I've got a couple of short ones. I think electric scooters are an excellent form of green mobility. I'm sure you've seen them around London. They're very, very popular. They're very affordable, relatively safe if you know how to ride them, get used to riding them. But I don't know if you're aware, they're actually illegal to be used as a personal electric scooter. The only scooters that are legal to use on our road at the moment are rental scooters, the ones that you see called Dot and Lime, that look quite popular as well. Are you aware of any legislation that might be coming into place to fully legalise electric scooters around the UK? And if not, do you think much of electric scooters to enable green mobility in the future? And the second question was a bit shorter. Does nasal breathing lessen the negative impact of air pollution?
Okay, so the second question about nasal breathing is a slam dunk one for you, Ian, I think.
It's a rather clever question. Yeah. I'm going to say no, not as much as you think it does. Now, the reason that I'm saying that is because you're thinking the nose is a really good filter, yes, of the big stuff that you don't want to go down into your lungs. But much of the stuff that we breathe, which we're concerned of, is of a size which kind of bypasses the sort of like filtering capacity of the nose. And I have to tell you that there's real concern at the moment about impacts of air pollution on the brain. And one of the routes by which they're concerned that there could be impacts on the brain are small particles which deposit in the nose, translocating through olfactory nerves from the surface of the nose to the brain. So I wouldn't say that's so simplistic, but it's a really good question because you're thinking about dose, and dose is a really interesting thing to think about.
Right, okay. E-scooters, any views on that to the panel?
I don't have a personal view on scooters. I think I agree that they can be, when used correctly and appropriately, they can be a really good source of transport and, you know, relatively low sort of in terms of emissions and so on. I think it is another case of, because they're relatively new, I don't think the legislators have got sort of round to even really thinking how they could integrate this mode of transport with the other suites of transport. Maybe they will at some point, and I don't know whether that will be sort of pushed by, you know, the public just more and more adopting them until they have to do something. Again, it would be nice to be proactive from a legislative point of view and actually think, well, how can we integrate these in? When is it appropriate? You know, when is it maybe not appropriate? Or, you know, and actually factor that into town planning. But I think, again, we're not near that point yet, I don't think.
Yeah.
So I don't know about the legislation, but I do know I can't think of a worse way in which they've been introduced. So we have legislation after they're already on our roads and people are already using them. It's been a shambles.
Yeah.
I don't know so much about the legislation, but
the legislation not catching up. Who'd have thought it?
I can provide some kind of insights from individual perspective about e-scooters. So firstly, I think the government is very cautious about it because it can be dangerous for a lot of people. Because if you think about it, it's almost like 30 miles per hour. You can ride it on the road, and it can be dangerous. And there were accidents happened in the past, and a lot of them are also running on the pavement, and then they can just run over the pedestrians. And on the other hand, I don't know if you know about this, Chinese mall bike scheme. So basically, they have this, shared bikes in the major cities, and the negative side of it is basically it creates a lot of bikes. People just left them everywhere, and it's another kind of create the rubbish for the city, basically. So it can be, a lot of downsides of, using this. If we talk about, a lot of people or a big numbers of, e-scooters, that can be a problem. Yeah. But any kind, types of mobility solutions, if you use too much is always a problem. So I think the ideal is to have a variety of solutions that people can choose by themselves. And if they want to go on the public transport and they have a good service, and if they want to go on the e-scooter, they can find it somewhere. And if they want to walk, of course they can do it. And they want to drive, there's facilities to around them to drive.
It's quite a regulatory sort of challenge, isn't it? And as the motorcyclist in the room here, I mean, these e-bikes as well that can do about 40 miles an hour. And people are going around in shorts and T-shirts on these things. And most motorcyclists, me included, I won't even go to the shops without my leather trousers, my armoured jacket, really good crash helmet, and people are just shooting past me on my motorbike, on e-bikes. Anyway, so, there's a safety issue and a regulatory issue there. I think we've got, before I start ranting, we have time for one more question. So let's bring you up to the front and introduce yourself.
There. I was just wondering, it was a pretty random question actually. So when I use the tube, I generally get this stuffy feeling of being in there. And I was wondering whether you have any insight on how the air quality, whether the air quality has been monitored, how it compares to taking a bus, for example, and whether you could find any solutions on clearing that, on how to clean that. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, very good question. And in fact, that is one of those dilemmas that, you know, many of us could think. We probably potentially came here by a variety of different ways. And if we were to ask the question, you know, which way do you think, or which route was the least polluted or most polluted, it wouldn't be easy to answer. And it's similar with the tube. I know that there were some, let's just say, preliminary studies, which was sponsored by the Mayor of London, where they actually had school children who travelled to school via various means, and they had sort of pollution sensors in their backpacks, and they were perhaps trying to understand the different modes of transport and what they were exposed to. But I don't think it's definitive at this stage to say, well, you know, the tubes are definitely more or less polluted than the roads. But I imagine with it being canyons and so on, it probably depends on if it's in a polluted environment, that pollution will probably stay there for longer.
I could answer this a little bit because my group published a paper 2 years ago, which is the entire tube map of London in terms of the pollution measurements made at every single station. And it also comes back to your question about, are you measuring the same thing? So if you're on a deep station on the underground, the concentrations of PM 2.5 are mad, yes? They're like 300, 400 micrograms per meter cubed. And to put that into context, the WHO announced last week that an annual level of 5 is bad for your health, yeah? So you're off the scale. Now, the argument which is used is we shouldn't compare that with outside air, because outside air is compositionally different, because the air on the tube, do you know that black dust in your nose? That black dust in your nose, yes, is magnetite, small iron particles depositing. So large amounts of it are magnetite, quite a lot of it in the nano range, so it would be picked up as a particle number very, very high. Now, it's often described by people as being within legal limits, which sounds crazy because I've just told you the legal limit is 5, and on some of those platforms it's in the hundreds. And that's because for the tube, they use the occupational safety limits, yes? Now, there's a question there. Should we be treating the tube as an occupational environment, like it's a factory, when it's a major transport conduit for millions of people each day who are members of the general public? So there are big issues going on. I'd have to say that London Underground are aware of it, TfL as well, are researching this, but the concentrations are high, and your question absolutely wasn't random. It's a really live discussion we're having at the moment.
Yeah, okay. And so just the final one, because you've scared us to death about going on the tube and indeed being on the road. So overground or underground, it's all pretty bad. Horrible question, which is worse? I mean, it's not like where are we safe, it's just like where are we at the least in mortal danger, I think is. Maybe you, Ian, or any of you. Field with a deck chair, says Ian. These are going to be our closing questions. Right, but seriously, because it's probably impossible then to seriously compare like with like between going on the tube and being on the road. You know, you get exposed to pollution. They're different kinds of particulates, but they're pretty bad, and either way.
I would say, I mean, everybody can make a comment on this. The reason the sensor technology is absolute genius, apart from the fact that if you give somebody who doesn't think air pollution is a problem a sensor and they look at the numbers, it changes their views entirely overnight, yes, is that it's led to this micro-scale modelling where people realise that there are some streets which are worse than other streets. So you can use the cityscape intelligently, yes?
Yeah, okay.
Tube, some stations are worse than other stations. Overground sections of the stations aren't so bad. In fact, they're better than the roads. So there is information which would allow you to patch together a way of moving around our city and minimising the harm air pollution does to your long-term health, if not necessarily completely reducing it to zero.
Right. Okay.
I'd probably just quickly add to that,
yeah,
that
sure.
If you're, I mean, in a way, this becomes really important if you're from a vulnerable group with maybe underlying respiratory illnesses. You know, planning your route could make a huge difference to your quality of life. So I think this sort of information is a type of information which, in its sense, may be a bit depressing just to know that there are some really polluted parts of London in various ways. But in reality, using that information to make an informed decision about how you travel and where you travel, or even when you travel, can make a big difference. So I think the more of that we can gather and integrate and make it accessible, which is the other thing, to the public, then I think the better we will be overall.
So data will make a big difference and is making a big difference. Jiayu, a final comment from you then, maybe just on data, just very briefly, just to wrap things up from us. You know, and maybe a note of optimism if you can, but it doesn't have to be.
On data?
Yeah, or just in general, yes, and just the data and indeed intelligent mobility design.
Yeah, when I think about data on intelligent mobility design, I think it's more about, how do you capture the individual data from people when they, a lot of, car companies are doing that. Of course, that can, be served back to say what is people's behavior, and then how do we provide a better service so that we can have less emissions on the road. But by saying that, of course, electric vehicles, they are electric vehicles, but where the electricity comes, when you're thinking about that, is still emissions there.
It comes from coal-fired power stations. Yeah, that's an issue. We could go on. And huge apologies to Jennifer Gould online, who wanted to talk about low-traffic neighbourhoods. I didn't even get there. Bad host, I'm afraid. Sorry, Jennifer. So if Jennifer or any of you would like to write that in their feedback, you can. So as we go into this little wrapping up session here, we really would appreciate your feedback. And any minute now, you'll see on the screen a link you can go to, or a QR code if you don't like writing links into your mobile phone. Give us some feedback about what we did well, what could be better next time. It's really, really useful. And also, if you want to re-watch this session or go back through any of the ones that you missed today, then you can go to our website so that you can see the URL on the screen. I've been saying it all day out loud. I've just realised it's on the screen. I could have saved myself and you a lot of URL-related pain. Anyway, there you go. But we're going to be putting these videos. They've been streaming. There's some high production values here. They'll be nice to watch. Share them with your mates and stuff. Include the bit where you pose the question and you can show off a bit. So all that kind of stuff. And don't forget, of course, that this festival is not just today. It runs tomorrow and indeed into the week. And lots of information on that website. And obviously, a huge thanks to our panel, to Jiayu, to Mark, and to Ian. To those of you who posed questions, very mutedly to me, Gareth Mitchell, for hosting it. But most of all, to you, brilliant audience at home and also here in the hall, the biggest audience of the day. So give yourself a big round of applause and enjoy your evening.